Encounters Radio. I'm Vic Cundiff, and I'll be your host for the show. If you've had an encounter of your own and would like to speak with me, whether in private or on the show, please go to dogmanencounters.com and submit a report. I'd love to hear from you. Tonight's guest is JT. JT, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Vic. It's good to be here.
It's great having you here. Thanks so much for coming. JT, please give us a brief bio on yourself.
Well, I don't want to give my real name, but I guess you can tell by my accent that I'm from the Southern Appalachians. One of the reasons that I want the anonymity is I hold a fairly sensitive position in the community. I have been involved in work, shall we say, that puts me out into the public eye locally. I hold a position of, I'm not famous or anything like that, but some prominence in the community, and people have confidence in me. But like I said, it's a position of authority and of some prominence in the community. I'm married and have been for 33 years. I have 2 children, and I always avidly been interested in cryptids and things like that, but I didn't know about the existence of what we're going to be talking about tonight.
You said you've always been interested in monsters and mysterious creatures. Did your encounter temper your interest in these things?
No, I've been interested in things like Bigfoot and the Mothman and things like that. The Loch Ness Monster. I watched the old In Search Of with Leonard Nimoy and Ancient Mysteries and things like that. In recent years, we've had programs on dealing with Bigfoot and things like that, and actually my interest in that is how I discovered Dogman Encounters and discovered that there was such a thing as a Dogman. I'd never heard of that, and of course I did on one program that I watched. It dealt with more than just Bigfoot. It brought in the Beast of Bray Road, but they didn't use the term Dogman, and so I was kind of surfing the internet and finding different things on Bigfoot, watching things on YouTube, and you know how it brings up the suggestions of things you might be interested in. And I saw Dogman Encounters, and that's what piqued my interest in Dogman Encounters, and I started listening to it, and it brought back the memory of something that I had just pushed out of my mind and really suppressed for 35 years.
Well, I'm so glad you did find out about the show. For 35 years, you kept this story to yourself. Why did you decide to come out with it now?
Well, it's been maybe about 8, 9 months, maybe even a year since I first discovered Dogman Encounters. And like I said, this thing, I had suppressed it, and it just all came flooding back to me as I began to, and I listened voraciously. All of the Dogman Encounters that had been made up to that point, I listened to them every night until I'd heard all of them that had been made up to that point. And it triggered this memory, and all these things started coming back to me, and the anxiety and the fear. You know, for all of this time, I've just had an anxiety about the woods and about driving at night and things like that. My wife and my children, I've always cautioned them when they're out at night to make sure that their doors are locked and their windows are rolled up so that nothing can get in. And really, I had psychological problems back years ago, and it caused me to engage in some behaviors that I shouldn't have at that time. And I really believe that this experience was what triggered that at this time. And I've been debating all this time about whether or not to contact you. And listening to the program and listening to other folks' encounters and you talking to them about what they had been through and putting out the information that you have and that your guests have, it really helped me to deal with this thing. And it really helped me to understand some of the problems that I've gone through. And listening to the program helped me. And so I got to thinking maybe if I just told somebody about it, because I hadn't told anybody. I've never told my wife. This thing happened when I was 17 years old. I didn't tell my parents. I never told any of my siblings. I've never told my children and none of my friends. I've never told anybody anything about what happened to me that night. And so, like I said, I'd been debating about it for a long time. And finally, the other night, I came to the decision that the program had been such a help to me, and listening to other folks had been such a help to me that I thought maybe that if I called you, of course I contacted you first of all and reported the encounter, and you called me, that if I talked to you about it and told you about it, that it would help me some more, and maybe by me talking about my encounter, maybe possibly that if I tell what I went through, that it could be a help to somebody else.
Well, I'm so glad you did decide to come forward, and if nothing else comes clear out of this interview, I want to make sure you totally understand this point, JT. Because of your encounter being such a bad one, I totally understand why you kept it suppressed for all the time that you did, and I totally understand why you didn't come out and share it with anyone for as long as you've waited to do so. You say you put this encounter out of your mind for years. In the long run, though, do you think you hurt yourself or helped yourself?
Vic, I don't believe that it helped me. I believe I actually hurt myself by doing it. And like I said, trying to deal with the anxiety, I turned to external things that I'm not going to go into and things that I shouldn't have been doing in order to cope with it and to deal with it. And that in turn caused me to hurt other people, some of them my family. And, of course, this has been a long time ago, and I've since stopped those behaviors. I stopped them years ago, but for a time there, I hurt other people because of the reaction that I had of what I went through and the things that I did to try to cope with it that brought out behaviors in me that did harm to other people, especially to those that I love. And I really regret that now. And if I hadn't kept it to myself, maybe if I had talked to somebody at the time and told them about it, maybe if I've got a real close friend that I've been friends with ever since I was in elementary school. I've lost contact with the vast majority of the people that I went to school with, and a lot of folks that I was friends with when I was a teenager, but I didn't him. I still haven't told him, but I believe if I had him, he probably would have understood, and maybe it would have helped me, and I would have gotten it off my chest, and I would have dealt with it better, and I wouldn't have wound up doing the things that I did that hurt other people.
I sure do hate to hear that you wound up hurting people in the process of trying to deal with this, but hindsight is 20/20. You can't go back and change those things now, as you very well know. Let's get into the details of this encounter now. Your encounter happened late one night in '81. Please tell us all about it. Give us every last detail that comes to mind.
All right. As I said, this event happened back in 1981. I was 17 years old. It was really hot that night, and it would have been probably the latter part of July or perhaps the first week or two in August. I mean, it was really hot, and of course I was driving that night when it occurred, and I was driving with my windows down because I didn't have any air conditioning. But anyway, this event happened when my wife and I were first dating. I think maybe we had been dating maybe about a year. I had just gotten my driver's license. Most teenagers get their driver's license when they're 16, but I didn't get mine until I was 17 years old. My dad had just bought me a 1968 Dodge Coronet, and I really loved that car, and I was really proud of it. It was kind of a burnished copper color with metal plate paint. It had nice mags on it.
We can't conduct a scientific survey while some jokers are out here pretending to be Junior or Bigfoot or whatever. Track these criminals down. Do not engage them. We just need to tip off the police. Follow the tracks.
Out there, but this engine
Remember,
had been bored
you're not
out.
a commando.
It's been built.
You're just
It had
documenting
quite a bit of
evidence.
power, and I had a nice set of cherry bomb mufflers on it. And man, I just loved the sound that it made as I drove along, as I downshifted or accelerated. The roar of that engine coming through those cherry bomb mufflers. And you know, now that I think back on it, and since we talked the other day, I've been thinking a little bit more about the encounter and trying to make
The trail
sense
ends here.
of it and why did it occur.
They were smart enough to
And I
cover
got
their
thinking
tracks.
about it. It's very possible I triggered the encounter that night, and really what I consider as an attack by what I was doing with the engine of
Whoever
that
is
car.
doing this,
Because,
we
you
need
know,
to
as
warn
I
the
would go
locals.
into curves
I can
and
cover
I'd
the net.
downshift,
The only other
maybe
person near you is Georgi Grankin. He's an older man, excellent carpenter, totally harmless.
Revving the engine.
I've
When I
marked his
come out
cabin
of
on the hunting
curves
mate.
into straightaways, I would kind of get into it just a
Georgi
little
used
bit.
to be a doctor in Moscow,
And,
very
just
prominent.
listening to the roar
He gave up the
of that
city life
engine
to move
coming
out
through
here in
those cherry bomb mufflers,
1978.
and maybe,
He's
I don't
alone,
know,
and
maybe
he
this
prefers
thing
it that
was
way.
in the middle of
So
a
don't be
hunt
surprised if he
as
and
I
his
was
dogs bark at you when you
driving,
approach.
and I'll tell in a moment where the event occurred, but as I was driving down this road, there was pasture fields on either side of me, bounded by high ridges and woodlands, and there was cattle and horses in the fields. And in other places, there was silage corn. I don't know if you know what that is, but primarily in this part of the country, I live in East Tennessee, just a couple of counties to the northwest of Smoky Mountains. And in our part of the country, it's primarily cattle farming, what people out west would call a small ranch operation. Primarily they raise beef cattle, some dairy cattle, and they raise silage corn. Of course, they harvest the ears of corn to feed the cattle and to feed hogs and things like that, horses. And they grind up the corn stalks and the leaves and everything and make what they call silage out of it, and they store it in silos, and they use that as feed for their cattle and horses and their hogs and things in the winter. And so I could see these cornfields, and it was a bright moonlit night, and I could see occasionally these cornfields, and also at that time there was a lot of tobacco race in this part of the country. Of course, there's not so much anymore, but back then just about everybody had their own patch of tobacco. They would raise tobacco and sell it. And I could see cattle and horses in the field. It was such a bright moonlit night. I could see in the fields almost as good as you could in the day. And also interspersed among the cattle and horses in the field were deer. And it's very possible that this thing was in the middle of a hunt and about to maybe spring on a deer or maybe even a cow or a calf. And I interrupted its hunt with the sound of this engine as I was driving down through here. But like I said, I live in East Tennessee, maybe about 500 yards south of the Virginia line. And my occurrence happened actually over the line in the state of Virginia. But I was going to see my wife, as I said, and I wanted to show her this car that I had got, that my dad had bought for me. I wanted to take her for a ride in it. I was real proud of it. I wanted her to see it. And I was going to visit her at her parents' house, which is actually the property that we live on now in our home. But she lived at that time, we were teenagers, and she lived at that time with her parents, and I lived with mine. This was several years before that we got married. But my grandparents, they lived on a road that's called Wagner Hollow Road, and this road runs about 20, 25 miles long, and it begins in southwest Virginia, and it crosses over the line and passes through 2 counties in Tennessee as well. But the occurrence happened on the Virginia side of the line. Like I said, my grandparents lived on this Wagner Hollow Road. I really don't know why they call it a hollow. It's really kind of a narrow valley, and just like most of the area around here, it primarily consists of narrow valleys and hollows, and bounded on all sides by high wooded ridges. We've got a lot of trees here. I mean, you could start from where I live, a squirrel could, and just about, almost without any breaks, except for, where the roads do pass through, travel from my house through the state of Virginia all the way to Cumberland Gap into Kentucky, and almost never have to touch the ground. I mean, there's just woods everywhere on all the ridges all around, and this is how this valley was, this Wagner Hollow Road. This is how it was. The road was real curvy, narrow country road, and it just kind of meanders through the valley all the way on the Virginia side and on the Tennessee side, with farmland on either side, and of course 3-strand barbed wire fences all along the way, and fields. The valley here, it goes anywhere from 300 or 400 yards on either side of the road, and in some places narrows down maybe to 150 yards or 100 yards or something like that, but it varies from different places. But anyway, I was going to take the route through this Wagner Valley Road to go and see my wife, and my grandparents lived in this Wagner Hollow Road. And my mother asked me if I would drop her off at my grandparents' house to visit with them while I went to see my wife, and then, come back and pick me up afterwards. And so I agreed to do that. So I took my mother to my grandparents' house, and I dropped her off, and I went on up to where my wife and I live now, to her parents' house, and I took her for a ride in the car, showed her the car, and I ate supper with them, and we stayed there and visited together till maybe about 11:15, something like that. And then I left, and I turned off the road that she lived on, where we now live, onto this Wagner Holler Road, and went back to pick my mother up at my grandparents' house. And now, as I said, this road, it's got a lot of sharp curves in it. There's some straightaways, but for the most part, it's just a windy, twisty, narrow country road. You can't go too fast. And of course, I just got my license. I was an inexperienced driver. My car, I hadn't had it too long, and I wasn't used to it. And so, of course, if you know anything about those muscle cars, they do great in the straightaway, and you can just fly with them. But they don't take curves too good, and so I couldn't go real fast. And I probably wasn't driving over 30 miles an hour at the maximum. And in a lot of cases, I was slowing down maybe to about 20 miles an hour. But in any event, I was going down through there, and I was downshifting and revving the engine and listening to the sound of the engine coming through those cherry bomb mufflers. And I was watching and looking at the cattle and the horses and the fields and everything, on either side as I was going down through there. And I was just getting ready to go into a long and sharp curve that curved around to the right hand. And I noticed on the right-hand side of the road, and as I was going down through here, like I said, the moon was lighting everything up, and I could see everything almost as good as I could during the daytime in the fields. But the ridges and the woods on either side, they just kind of appeared like clumps, shadowy clumps. I couldn't really see much detail from them. And as I began to go into this long curve to the right, there was a shadow that kind of detached from maybe about 100, 150 yards off on my right, kind of detached from the shadows of the tree line and started moving at an angle away from the tree line, almost paralleling my vehicle, but coming at an angle. And I could tell by the way that the road was curving around to the right and the angle that this thing was moving, but it was going to intersect my vehicle. And I mean, this thing was moving on. Now, what I'm about to tell you about, Vic, this all happened, and it couldn't be more than just a few seconds, maybe 20, 30 seconds, something like that, certainly less than a minute, and couldn't have been any longer than that. But it just seemed like time just slowed down to a crawl, and it just seemed like everything was moving in slow motion. I don't know what it was about it, but there was something about this figure that just unnerved me, and it just made me uneasy. This, whatever it was, this thing it just didn't look, I couldn't really tell what it was about it, but there was something about it that just looked unnatural to me. Of course, I found out later on why that was as it got closer to me, and I could tell what it was. And this thing was actually taking a longer path of travel than I was, the way that it was running. But I could tell, I mean, this thing was going to come in direct contact with me somewhere around this curve. And, I mean, it was moving fast. I mean, super fast. I couldn't really tell what it was, but, I mean, it was one of the fastest moving things that I'd ever seen. Anyway, as I'm coming around this curve, this thing is just keeping my attention, and my eyes are darting back and forth from the right. I have to look at the road, or I'm going to run out of the road because I'm going around the curve, but it's drawing my attention. I keep looking at it and trying to figure out what this thing is and what it is that's so strange about the way that it looks. And it begins to draw a little bit closer to me. And, I kind of thought maybe when it first came out, maybe it might be a deer. There's a whole lot of white-tailed deer in this area that we live in, and pretty much on a daily basis when I'm going to work, I'll see one somewhere along the way that's been hit by a car and killed. I didn't want this thing to run out in front of me and hit my car. And for one thing, at that time in Tennessee, there was no law requiring you to have automobile insurance, and my dad, he didn't believe in having it. And so I didn't have any insurance on my car, and I didn't want this thing, whatever it was, to cause me to wreck or to hit my car and do damage to it, because I didn't have the money to fix it or to replace it. But then as I was watching this thing, I noticed that there was something strange about it. I noticed that whatever it wasn't running on all fours. Whatever this thing was, it was on 2 feet. I didn't understand what it was. It just seemed to me like, the only thing that I know of in this area, and we do have black bears, they're rare, but we do have some in this area, but a black bear just cannot move at the speed that this thing was moving at. A black bear, when it gets up on its hind legs, it's just not natural for it, and it just moves in a clumsy fashion. And this thing, whatever it was, it was just moving super fast, and it was just fluid in its motion, in the way that it ran, and no bear could get up on its hind feet and run in the way that this thing was running. But yet, it couldn't be a man. I knew that it could not be a man, because I ran track when I was in high school. I ran the 880 relay, ran the 440, and I knew that a human being could not run as fast as this thing was running. And I just couldn't understand what this thing was that was angling across this field and coming toward me, and I knew that was going to intersect me as it came across this field. And as I'm going along, it starts to get a little bit closer as it's running at an angle, but yet at the same time kind of parallel with my car. And it's keeping up with my car. It's keeping up with the speed that I'm going at. And I don't understand this. I don't understand how this thing can be going and keeping the same speed as my car. I'm coming into this sharp curve, and I've got to slow down. And I know that this thing pretty soon is going to come out, maybe jump out in front of me and meet the line of travel of my car. And as it drew closer, I began to see more details about this thing, and it for definite sure was running on its hind legs. It wasn't on all fours. It was on its hind legs like a man, but it wasn't like a man. This thing was on its hind legs, but it wasn't standing up fully erect like a human being does. This thing it kind of appeared stooped as it was running. It was standing up. It was on its hind legs, but yet it wasn't standing up straight. And this didn't look like a human figure. It looked like something totally different. It looked like something that, I've never seen anything that looked like this thing. And as it begins to draw closer, I began to pick out more details about it. And I can tell that whatever this thing is, it don't have knees like a human being does. This thing has hocks like a horse or a cow or a deer or something like that. But a four-legged animal like that cannot run on its hind legs like that. Cannot possibly move as fast and as fluidly and as swiftly as this thing was moving. And then I noticed, I could see in the moonlight that it looked like it had a big dog's head. That's all I know how to explain it. It had a long snout on it like a wolf or maybe like a German Shepherd. And it looked like it had long, tall ears that were standing straight up on the top of its head. And I could see that it had a long, bushy tail. And the only thing I know that I can think of that it reminded me of was a coyote's tail. But at that time, I don't think, we've got them here now. They came in here now, but I don't think we even had coyotes in this part of the country at that time. I'd never heard about it anyway. And there's no way that a coyote would be that big, and there's no way that it could run on its hind legs like this thing was running. And that tail, it stringed out behind it, that long bushy tail, and it was kind of bouncing up and down a little bit as it was running. And I noticed that this thing had arms, and that the arms, they were kind of pumping like a human being's, but, when a human runs, a human being pumps his arms almost as fast as his legs are moving, and this thing was kind of pumping them, but they weren't moving as fast as its legs were moving. And another thing that I noticed the majority of the time when a human being runs, a human kind of clenches their fist when they run, and this thing wasn't doing that. It was almost holding its hands, and that's what they looked like. It didn't look like paws to me. I can only describe them as hands. It more or less looked like they were hanging almost limp as it ran, and I could see the fingers hanging down as this thing ran. And as it began to draw closer, I could see that it had hair or fur all over its body. I could see that, and I could tell that. I couldn't really tell for sure, but it looked to me like it was black. But later on, I realized that that's what color it was, but I really couldn't tell the color yet at this point. And so this thing begins to draw closer. And as I said, it was a really hot night, and I was driving along in my car, and I had my windows rolled down because I didn't have any air conditioning on it. And, you know, this thing keeps drawing closer and closer to me, and I just, you know, my unease just grows more and more, and I'm starting to get scared. I don't understand it. I don't know what this thing is. I just can't make out what this thing is. It don't look like anything that I've ever seen before. And it begins to draw closer. It gets close to the barbed wire fence on the right-hand side. And I think, well, maybe it's going to slow down, or maybe it'll veer off where it won't run into that barbed wire and it'll turn aside out of my way. But it didn't do that. Instead of doing that, this thing sped up. And instead of turning aside, it jumped right over the fence. And it landed on my side of the fence, in between the ditch line and the fence, and then it took another bound. And the next thing I know, this thing is out in the road. I mean, it's right next to my vehicle, and it scared me so bad that I jerked the wheel, and I ran over into the left lane, and I was driving in the left-hand lane, and if there'd been a car coming, I mean, you know, it would have hit me head on, but it scared me so bad when this thing jumped across the fence, and I thought it was going to jump right into my vehicle, that I you know, just not thinking, instinctually, I just jerked the wheel to the left and went over as far as I dared into the left-hand lane. And this thing, it started running right along beside of me. And I want to tell you, Vic, like I said, I had the windows rolled down, but I had cherry bomb mufflers on that car, and if you know what they're like, they're loud. But yet, at the same time, I could hear the nails of this thing, the toenails, click, 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 clacking on the road as it ran along beside me. And I could see it good now. And, you know, I really didn't want to look at its face. I really didn't want to see its face. But I couldn't help it. It's just like I couldn't help myself. I had to. And, I mean, this thing was tall. It had to be at least 7 feet tall. It towered over the top of my car. And it was running along beside me. It couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 feet off the passenger side of my car. Just, I mean, right even with my passenger side window. I could see it just as clear as day as it ran along beside of me. And I really didn't want to see its face. But I felt like I just couldn't help it. I had to. And so, and it was so tall, I had to kind of lean over, almost lay over on the right side, kind of in the seat, and prop myself up with my hand on the right side while I hung on to the wheel and drove with the left to get a look at it and to see its face. And I wish that I hadn't, but I did. You know, this thing definitely, I mean, it had to be, like I said, it had to be 7 feet tall, Vic. Oh, God. This thing, it looked like a gigantic wolf or maybe
this is Georgie's cabin,
like
but why aren't his dogs barking?
Or something like that. But
move in for a closer look.
Its ears were different. They were slim, and they were high and pointed, like I said, on top, and had kind of like tusks sticking out. And, you know, I've heard a lot of people describe these things, and I've heard them say that you know, they couldn't tell what they were. But I'm here to tell you this thing was a male. There was no doubt about that. I mean, it was right there in the open, in the clear, just as plain as day, right in front of me. And I'm not going to use any kind of vulgarity or anything like that, but let me just put it this way. As I leaned over and looked out the vehicle, I mean, I could tell just exactly what it was, because it was right there at the base of his belly, right in front of me, and I could tell just as plain as day that it was a male. This thing is running along the side of
I don't like this gas canister.
And
Georgie relies on dogs and a sled for transportation.
It's like
he doesn't need gasoline. Please, check inside.
It's not even paying attention to me in my car. Like it don't even notice.
Empty.
Or like it
Maybe
just don't
Georgi
even
took his
care,
dogs to the village for supplies.
about me being there in that car.
Anything unusual there?
As it's running along.
Signs of foul play?
And you know, my eyes are darting back and forth, like I said, from the road to this thing as I'm
you say
trying
they
to
smell
drive
like
around
gasoline.
this curve.
Short.
And man, I wanted to hit
Here
the gas.
I am thinking Georgi is some prankster's victim, but Georgi is the
But I
prankster.
didn't dare do it
What is
because
the
I
old
was
man
afraid I
thinking?
would run out of the road
Please,
and run
take
into
a
the
photo
ditch
to document this
and
for
I
the
would
police.
wreck. And I'd be with this thing, and I mean, I'd just be right there at its mercy. But yet I wanted to because I could tell. I mean, this thing had arms. If it hadn't had them,
So,
if it
perhaps old Georgi has lost his mind.
as it ran,
I think it's best that you collect any firearms from the cabin before you leave.
Vic, and I know that if it wanted to, this thing could have reached right in my car window and right over to the driver's side, from the passenger side, and this thing could have grabbed me and it could have drugged me right out of the car. If it wanted to, it could have just ripped my head off, or it could have leaned in my car window and it could have bit my head off. I don't know.
That shotgun is old,
and I
it's
wanted
rusty,
to get out of there,
but if it still fires, it's good for protection against bags.
That if I hit the gas, this car probably wasn't going to be able to handle the curve.
I need to call the police.
The ditch, and I was going to wreck.
Thank you for handling this with your usual discretion.
With this thing.
Georgi's an old friend of the Nannets. Hopefully he meant no harm.
Like
I will be in touch shortly.
I got a good look at it. I got a real good look at what this thing looked like, and it was just as jet black as it
The state surveyor's office called me today with reports of a trail of blood somewhere in the area. I've noted on your hunter mate.
3 or 4 inches long, thick fur.
Probably a large animal, like a moose or like a bear. See what you can find.
And,
Careful out there.
It was just thick all over its body, except for it kind of thinned out down on its belly, kind of up above its legs. But other than that, it was just thick hair, maybe about 3-4 inches long, and up around its head, the back of its head, and kind of like down over, I don't know what to call it other than shoulders, down over its shoulders. It was maybe about 5-6 inches long, just a little bit longer. I've heard people describe it kind of as like the mane of a lion, but it wasn't that long. It wasn't that much difference in the length of the hair, but you could tell that it's just a little bit longer. And this thing, like I said, it had a long snout on it, like a German Shepherd or like a wolf. And I could see as it was running along beside me, I could see its mouth was kind of relaxed and open, and I could see that it had jagged, shaped teeth like a dog's got on the side of its mouth. But it had fangs that were about maybe 4 inches long that were hanging down over its bottom lip, and the bottom ones were disappearing up into the top lip. But its mouth was kind of parted, and it kind of had its tongue hanging out on the left side of its mouth, just like a dog does as it runs along as it's painting. And like I said, this thing wasn't paying a bit more attention to me than if I wasn't even there. And for a little while, it just ran along beside me and just didn't pay me any attention. But that didn't last. Just slowly, seemed like it took forever, but just slowly, it started to turn its head, and it looked at me. And I know that you said that you shouldn't, and I've heard other people say that you shouldn't, but I couldn't help it. I looked full in its eyes. I wish that I hadn't. I wish I'd never seen it. I wish I could erase the picture of what I saw from my mind, but I can't. And, I've heard people say that they had amber or yellow eyes or red or orange-like eyes, but that's not what I saw that night. This thing had great big black eyes, and I couldn't see any kind of pupil. I couldn't see any kind of white or anything like that, but all I could see was black, and then they just looked as black to me as the bottomless pit. They just seemed soulless to me. And I tell you, Vic, I just had a sense of evil that came over me. And this thing, when it looked at me, it was like that it could look through me and look to my very soul. And like I said, I just felt like I had been touched by evil. I don't know how else to explain it. And there was such a fear. And I wanted to scream or to holler out or do something. but it just seemed like my mouth just dried up like cotton, and there wasn't a sound that would come out. And I wanted to get out of there. I wanted to get away from this thing, but I couldn't because I was afraid I was going to wreck. And then it came closer to my vehicle, Vic, and it leaned down. It leaned in, and mind you, this thing is running beside my car the whole time. And it leaned over, Vic, and it stuck its head in my window, and it grabbed hold of my door with its right hand, and that, I don't know how to describe it as other than that. It was a hand, and I know that people have described this thing as, I said that they kind of look like raccoon hands, and maybe in a way that's right, or maybe a mix between the hand of a raccoon and maybe the hand of a monkey, something like that. But this thing had huge hands, and it had long black nails, maybe about 3 inches long, 2 or 3 inches long, on the ends of its nails, long black thick nails. And this thing put its right hand on my door, and I could hear it. It put its left hand on my doorknob, and it was jerking at my door, and it was jiggling my door handle. But thank goodness, when I had been at my wife's house, then my girlfriend, and I'd been at her parents' house, I'd locked the car. And when I came back out, I didn't unlock that door because nobody was going to be riding with me at that point before I went back to get my mother. And so it wasn't able to get my door open. But this thing was leaning in my window, and it was looking right at me. And it seemed like that it curled its lips back. And I know it snarled at me, but I don't really remember hearing it. All I could hear was the sound of my engine and the sound of its toenails as it ran along beside my vehicle, going clack, 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 clack on the pavement. And I could see it breathed on me, and it was hot breath, and it was. You know how people describe that breath as being kind of fetid, and seemed like I could smell blood and maybe decaying flesh as it breathed on me. It was horrible. And, I thought I was dead. I thought this was the end of me. I thought I was a goner. I thought I was a dead man for sure. And just about that time, the curve ended, and I came into a straightaway. And I just hit the gas and pushed it to the floor. And I took out of there. I took my eyes off of it, and I looked ahead. And out of the corner of my eye, I saw its nails. I saw it lose a grip on my car door, and I saw its nails rake across the top of my door. And its head disappeared from my window. And I don't know, I had to be going 70 or 80 miles an hour. I don't know for a time there. I just had to peel out there and get away from this thing. And as I drove away from it, as I pulled away from it, I looked in my rearview mirror, and I could see it get smaller and smaller as it began to slow down. And the last thing I remember, the last thing that I saw, this thing veered off to the right again and jumped over the fence and disappeared into that field. And I'm telling you, Vic, I've never been so scared in all of my life. It was just absolutely horrifying. And I went on and drove on, and this happened maybe about 2 miles from my house where I live now, and maybe it couldn't have been over a mile and a half from my grandparents' house. And I went on there, and I picked my mom up, but I never told her a thing about what happened. And I never told my wife, who was my girlfriend at the time. Like I said, I never told her, and I've never told her in the 35 years since this has happened. I never told any of my friends. I didn't tell my dad. I've never told any of my children. I've never told anybody until I filed the report with you the other day. And you called me. I never talked to anybody about this and told them about what happened. I tell you, it was the most horrifying experience of my life. And my dad, he asked me the next day where the scratches came from on my vehicle. And I told him that I run out of the road and I run into a thorn bush, and that's where the scratches came from. And I tell you, Vic, I love that car. I loved it. But I could not keep that car thinking about what happened and what I went through that night. I just couldn't keep it. I had to get rid of it. And I traded that car for a 74 Nova. and I got rid of it. And you know, as time went on, I mean, I couldn't sleep. I didn't sleep for nights after this. If I would drift off to sleep, I'd wake up having nightmares, seeing this thing happen over and over again, and I couldn't keep it out of my mind when I'd lay in my bed, and I'd think about it, and I'd just go over and over and over what happened in my mind. And you know, that night, I didn't know what I'd seen. I really didn't understand what it was. You know, I'd read about and heard about werewolves and things like that, but I really didn't connect this thing with that. And you asked me, you mentioned, maybe in the pre-interview, you mentioned about horror movies, and I can tell you right now, I don't watch horror movies. I hear people talk about saying it looked like this werewolf in this movie or that movie, but I've never seen them. The only werewolf movies that I ever saw was the old Lon Chaney movies when I was a kid. That's the only ones I've ever watched. Anything that come out after 1981, I can tell you right now, I've not seen it because I won't watch it. My wife, when my kids were little, my sisters would come up and they loved horror movies, and my wife loves horror movies, and so did my children. And my wife, you know, they'd go, and back then we had VCRs, and we rented movies, and they'd go out and they'd rent horror movies, and I'd go to bed, or I'd go off in another room. I could not watch them, and I can't watch them to this day. I told you this caused just extreme bad behavior in me. I mean, I engaged in things. I'm not going into details what they were. I hate that I did them, but I did things that I know now was trying to deal with this. But, you know, I put it out of my mind, and I suppressed it for all those years. But yet there was something that bothered me, and, you know, my house is only about 40 or 50 yards from the woods. I've got woods in behind my house. I've got woods on the right side of my house. I've got woods on the left side of my house. And I've always had an anxiety about living so close to the woods. And I know now that that's why that is. And when I go out in my backyard, I just can't stay out there because I feel like that there's something out there, that there's something lurking in the woods that's looking at me and that's watching me. And I just can't stand it, and I have to go back in the house. And, you know, I used to want to hunt, but in 35 years after this thing has happened to me, since I saw this thing that I now know, I couldn't explain it then. I thought maybe it might be a demon. I thought maybe I was having a waking nightmare, or maybe it was just my imagination. I just didn't have any explanation for it. And I now know that that thing was a dog man. I didn't know about them then, and I didn't understand, but now I know that's what that thing was. And I tell you, Vic, like I said, I used to want to hunt, but I can't do it. In the past 35 years, I have not hunted one time. I own guns. I love guns, but the only thing that I do is target shoot with them. I don't take them into the woods because I just can't do it. I mean, I tried to go a couple of times, but I just couldn't stand it. I just had to leave because there's something out there, and I know it's out there. And, you know, like I said, I put this thing out of my mind, and I really wasn't thinking about what it was.
That bear sounds weak.
I know what it is now.
You're not far from him.
Because when I heard the description of a dogman on Dogman Encounters, this all came flooding back to me. And I know what it is now. And I tell you, Vic, I know that these things are real. I know that night it wasn't a demon, it wasn't my imagination, it wasn't some kind of waking dream. I know that I saw a real, living, breathing animal. And I tell you, I believe these things are dangerous. I mean, I hear about these people that want to have an encounter and go out and hunt for them or hunt for Bigfoot. You know, there was a time I thought maybe I might like to do something like that. But I tell you right now, I think they're crazy. These things are nothing to fool with. And I don't think anybody ought to go out there looking to meet up with one of these things. You may meet up with it for real. And you may wish, like I wish, that you had never seen the thing. And I tell you, I've heard you say that you shouldn't ever look these things in the eye. But
looks
I did
like it was
that.
probably caught in a faulty trap,
full into
left
the eye,
behind
and it
by
felt like it was looking into my
or
very
careless
soul.
hunters.
I felt like it
Not
knew
everyone is an
everything about
upstanding
me.
citizen
And
like
when it
you.
looked at me that night, and something else I forgot to mention a while ago, when it stuck its head in my open window and looked at me and curled its lips back. I mean, like I said, it was like it was giving me a seditious grin, and it licked its chops. You know, you've seen a wolf or a dog do that. It licked its chops at me, Vic, like it was telling me, I know that your lunch, There's not a thing that you can do to stop me if I want to hurt you. And you look awful
no animal should
delicious
suffer
to me.
like that.
I mean, that's
Some
how
people
I feel.
have no respect.
That's what it looked like
Those
to me.
people rarely
That it was
last long in the
conveying to me
taiga.
that night.
But you,
and I tell
with
you, I
every
was
task,
scared to death.
you
I was
prove that you
horrified.
deserve to be here.
I've never, ever experienced anything in my life that scared me so bad as that did that night. Oh, it was awful. And basically that's what happened.
Before I send you into Nanet's territory,
JT,
I need you to pack away some substantial
bless
meat
you.
for the incoming expedition party.
Oh, it was awful.
I've marked the location
That
on the
was a
hunt
really
mate.
bad encounter.
That's a good spot to hunt for
Do you
bigger
feel
game.
any better now
Reindeer
that
or
you've
moose
been
will
able to
do.
get that story out?
Yes, Vic, I have to say, I feel so much better. But I want to tell you right now where I'm sitting, I'm sitting in an abandoned parking lot, and it's kind of overgrown, and there's trees up around me, and I'm starting to feel a little bit anxious about that, but I do feel better about talking to somebody about this.
Oh, I can understand your anxiety. Speaking of that topic right there, after going through such a nightmarish encounter, why do you still live in such a heavily wooded area?
Well, really, I don't have any choice. I mean, unless I moved into some kind of subdivision, and even the subdivisions aren't that far away from it. The part of country that I live in East Tennessee and Southwest Virginia, it's all the same. Southeastern Kentucky's the same. West Virginia's the same. North Carolina's the same. I mean, you know, like I said, I live in Appalachia, and everything around here is narrow valleys and hollows and draws and things like that. And we're just surrounded on every side. I mean, we've got forest everywhere. I mean, there's trees everywhere. Unless I move out of this part of the country, there's nowhere I can go to get away from.
Oh, I see. That makes sense. You said you live about 2 miles from where that encounter happened. What kind of anguish and problems does that cause for you?
Oh, it causes me a lot of problems. Of course, like I said, I had suppressed this thing and put it out of my mind. But yet, at the same time, I just felt anxiety about living where I do. And I love this part of the country. You know, I've had opportunities to move away. I could make more money if I did. I could do what I do here. I could do it somewhere else, and I could make a lot more money. And I've had offers, but I love this part of the country, even though it does give me anxiety to be surrounded so much by woodland and know there's so much wildlife around me, and maybe things that aren't known to science, and maybe things that are dangerous, but yet I love this area, and I love my family. I don't want to go away from my family. Even though I'm 52 years old, I still have grandparents alive. My mother's still living, and my wife's parents are still living. And I don't want to leave my family, but it does cause me worry about what might be out there lurking in the woods. There's a fairly good population here where I live, but yet at the same time, there's enough woodland around here, enough forest to hide 1,000 of these things, and nobody ever see them if they didn't want to be seen.
Since your family members don't know about dogmen, does that cause you a lot of angst, worrying about what kind of danger that might put them in?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I worry about it all the time. Of course, we do live in dangerous times with all the terrorism we have and violence and crime. But, you know, that's how I've always explained it, by worrying about that. And my children are grown, by the way. My oldest son's in his 30s, and my youngest son's in his 20s. They don't like it because I caution them and I call them, and I want them to let me know where they are and if they're safe and all like that. And they tell me, you know, Dad, we're grown men, but, you know, I still worry about them. And I worry about my wife like that. And she tells me I'm overprotective of her, but deep down I believe that that's what has caused me to be that way all this time.
Yeah, that is a difficult position that all this has put you in, so I can understand the difficulty in dealing with it. Since you had your encounter, have you heard about anyone else in your area seeing what might have been a dogman?
No, I've not really heard anybody else talk about that, but I've got a neighbor that I haven't actually talked to him personally. I've had an in-law tell me about it because he knows the guy, but a man that lives near me in the same community that I live in, he says that there's a Bigfoot up there, but I haven't ever personally seen anything like that, but you know, I've heard about it.
Well, considering all the timber you have around you, I'd be astonished if you didn't have a pretty healthy population. I know that's not news you want to hear, but that's how it is. Have there been unusual numbers of pets and or farm animals that went missing in your area?
Well, you see all the time on telephone poles and things like that, you see pictures of cats and of dogs up and rewards offers for saying they're missing and, giving contact information and all like that. I've even had people tell me or call me or maybe even post things on Facebook asking to watch out for missing animals. But, it seems like you don't ever hear about them being found, only about them being missing.
Yeah, sounds like you've got a real problem there. That's not to say that it's dogmen that are behind that, but it sure does make you wonder. How does it feel being able to get all this off your chest now?
Oh, I tell you, it is a great relief of mine. I didn't really know how much it would. I thought maybe it would. Maybe it might help some because, it helps to talk about problems that you have and events that go wrong in your life and things like that. Intellectually, I understood it had to help to talk to somebody about it, but I really didn't know how much it was going to help me. And I tell you, Vic, I feel so much better than I did before I told somebody about this.
Well, that's really good news. That's what this is all about. I'm so glad to hear that. As the years have gone by, has it gotten easier for you to deal with that experience, or did it stay just about the same?
Well, up until 8-9 months, maybe a year ago, when I first heard dogman encounters, I just put it out of my mind, and I wasn't dealing with it. I mean, I'll just be honest with you. I wasn't dealing with it. And like I said, for a time after this occurred, maybe for about 3 years before my wife and I got married, I engaged in some very, very destructive behavior, and I almost destroyed our relationship by the things that I did, and I almost destroyed the relationship with my other family members before I came to my senses and saw what I was going to lose if I continued on in the behavior that I was engaging in. And it very well could have been destructive to my health, could have even resulted in my death. I mean, I was really, really careless with what I was doing. But, I just buried it behind me in my mind after that and put it away and suppressed it. And I know that now, but even at that, there would be times that I handled my relationships with my wife and my children and others well and was nice and kind to them, but yet there was a deep-seated anxiety that was still there. There was still something that was bothering me, and it just plagued my mind, and at times I would just explode in a rage. I never hurt any of them. I never hit them or anything like that. And I wasn't verbally abusive other than just being hateful. But, I understand now that that thing that I had buried in the back of my mind that was still bothering me, I know that was the source to it. And since I've had this outlet with dogman encounters and listening to the other people talk about what they've gone through, it's helped me so much. And I know this is going to help me even more in the future, having told somebody about this.
I'm so glad this has helped you the way it has. Besides the way you mentioned treating your family, is there anything else you wish you could go back and do differently?
Well, to be honest with you, Vic, I had a good friend in high school, and he's still my friend now. We're still friends today. And we've been friends for over 40 years, and he knows just about everything about me. The only person who knows me better is my wife and my mother. And I wish now that I had told him about that. And I may tell him here before too long, maybe the next time that we get together, I'll just come out and tell him. And I think maybe he might have been understanding. I wish I had told somebody about this. I don't think I would have had the problem that I had as a result of it.
Well, I wish you would have told someone too. Sounds like he probably would have been the best person to share this with, but it sounds like you are on a good solid road to recovery, so that's a good thing. It's pretty easy to predict some of the effects your experience had on you, but were there any effects one wouldn't expect?
Well, like I said, it just made me so leery of the woods. And, I tell you, there's a great tradition of hunting in my part of the country. I mean, everybody hunts. A lot of people in my family hunt on both sides, but that's something that I just can't do now. And, I never would have thought that would have had that effect on me. As a kid, my dad never took me hunting. He just wasn't a hunter, but I had uncles and cousins that they loved to hunt, and I would go with them as a kid, and I really enjoyed it. I never would have thought that I would reach a place where I'd be unable to do it, but I just can't. I just can't. I can't go. I can't. You know, when I was talking to you the other day, because my wife don't know about this, I kind of walked into the woods, but I couldn't walk very far. I maybe went about 15 or 20 yards into the woods, and I had to turn around and come back out because I just couldn't take it. I just can't stand it. I just feel like, I mean, I'm constantly looking around me. I just feel like maybe something's going to jump out on me or something like that. I mean, I just have such a sense of anxiety. I just can't deal with being in the woods.
Most eyewitnesses go through the exact same thing you're talking about going through yourself, so that's no surprise. Do you feel like you're better prepared to handle another encounter now if you happen to have one?
Oh, I believe that I would, Vic, most certainly. I think I can handle it better now because, for one thing, I'd know what it is. I'd understand what it is, and at the time that this happened, I just did not understand what this thing was. I didn't know what to make of it. I'd never heard of anything like that. And even though, yeah, it kind of looked like, I guess, what they say a werewolf looks like, but I just didn't connect with that, and I didn't have any explanation for it.
Oh, sure, yeah, that's to be expected. When you see something like that, it's going to be hard to put a finger on it and explain it. Did you learn anything about yourself through all this that you wouldn't have expected?
Yeah, I learned I wasn't as tough as I thought I was. I was raised in a fairly rough family. My father was a rough man. I mean, this was the kind of guy, he made me get in my first fight when I was a kid. I mean, he was a rough guy, and I grew up around rough people, and I thought I was tough, but I found out when I ran into this thing, I wasn't anywhere near as tough as I thought I was.
I don't blame you for not wanting to tangle with one of these things. That wouldn't be a smart move. Some elderly sisters told you one time about a wild man that looked in a window at them. Please tell us about what happened to him.
These two ladies, both of them passed away, maybe within a year or two of one another, but both these ladies lived almost into their hundreds. So they were up like 98, 99 years old when they died, 97, something like that. So they would have probably been born, in the 19-teens anyway, maybe around 1910, something like that. And I run into these ladies in church. I'll let you know that much. That's how I was acquainted with them. They knew who I was and what I was and about my position and all like that. So even though they told me about what they called a wild man, which as soon as they did, I knew they were talking about a Bigfoot, but that's not what they called it. Like I said, they called it a wild man. And back then, now in this area that I live in, most places didn't get electricity around here until, it's poor. Like I said, it's Appalachian. It was a poor area, and most of the rural communities and areas didn't get electricity until, after World War II. People still lived in log cabins, and this particular family, and I'll call them the McAllisters. That's not their real name, but it's a Scottish name like that. There's a lot of Scottish Irish in my part of the country. But they had two log cabins in their family. Part of the family lived in one log cabin, and part of the family lived in the other. And these things happened that they were telling me about when these old women were little girls, when they were just, I think maybe it was happening in their preteen and their teenage years before they got married. Of course, back then, around here, women got married 14, 15, 16 years old, so they had to be, real young. And they said that there was what they called a wild man that would come and peck on the sides of their cabin, and that would throw rocks and sticks at their cabin, and that would try to look in their windows and look at them at night. And, of course, they described this wild man as being real tall and big, and they described it as not wearing any clothes and having hair all over its body. And as soon as they described that, I knew that they had to be talking about a Bigfoot, but they never once used the term Bigfoot or the term Sasquatch. They just called them wild men, and that's all. They're not the only one. I've heard other people, old people, talk about stories like that about wild men, and I didn't know it at the time, but, one of the biggest sayings that people warn their kids around here in this part of the country is, you better not be outside after dark because Booger Man will get you. And I didn't realize it when I was a kid, and I remember my grandparents saying that to me. And I didn't realize when I was a kid that when they said booger man, they were talking about a Sasquatch or a Bigfoot. That's what they were talking about, but I didn't realize that. I thought, the booger man or something like that was the devil or something, because they used it in that connotation as well. But I realize now that they were talking about Bigfoot when they were talking about booger man that will get you. And that brings to mind another event that occurred, and I really didn't connect the dots on this at the time that it happened, but now that I think back on it, there's a possibility that it could have been a dog man or a Sasquatch that we heard. But my wife and I, like I said, we live on the property. The property that we live on, it's been in her family for generations. And this particular property that we live on, we don't live in the same house as her parents and grandparents did. We built a new house on this property. And we started building it right before we got married. I hired contractors to do most of the work, but some of it I did myself. And the guys that had laid the block to my house, they didn't actually lay it high enough. They laid it about a run or two of blocks shorter than they should have been. And so the ceiling in my basement wasn't going to be 8 foot high once I poured 4 inches of concrete in my basement. So I had to go after the fact, after the block had been laid and the house had been framed up, and I realized this, I had to go back and I had to dig my basement down by hand with a pick and a mattock and a shovel to get it down far enough when we poured the concrete that we'd have a normal sized ceiling in our basement. Well, one night I was worked right on almost till dark, and my wife, she came up from her parents' house, and it was summertime then too, and it was hot, and she knew I'd been sweating, and so she brought me some tea to our house where we were building it so that I could, have something cool to drink. And we stood around there in the house and talked for a while about what our plans were going to be with the house, what all we were going to do, what we were going to have in it, and what we would do after we got married. And before we realized it, it had gotten dark on us. And so my wife, she looked out of the window, and she saw that it was dark, and she told me, she said, "It's dark. We'd better get out of here and get back to the house." She's talking about her parents' house. You never know what might happen. And so we left, and of course, we were dating then, and, we were walking real close to one another. And as we left and started walking down the hill, off to the left side of my house, there's kind of like a ravine or a gully. And, of course, it's all overgrown with trees, and it was then. And as we started to walk down the hill, all of a sudden it sounded like maybe something had fell down and grunted real big. And it just scared my wife to death. And of course, I didn't connect anything, never thought anything about it. I thought somebody was messing around up there and spying on us. And it made me mad. And like I said, at that time, I considered myself a big, tough guy. Of course, I found out when I saw that dog man, I wasn't as tough as I thought I was. But anyway, I was going to go over there, and I was going to see who that was messing around. And if they wanted to take it up with me, I was going to straighten them out. But my wife, she wasn't having any of it. It scared her to death. She grabbed me by the hand, and she took off that hill, and buddy, she had the hold of my hand like a vice grip, and she wasn't going to let go. She wanted to get out of there, and she drugged me off that hill. And, I've thought about that since then. That very well could have been. It might not have been a human being messing around. I mean, it was a big tangle of brush and thorn bushes and big trees and stuff like that down in that draw. And it's steep, too. It's unlikely that a human being would have been there. And it very well may have been a Bigfoot or maybe even a dog man. And maybe it's a good thing that she did, and I didn't go over there and see what that was. And, Vic, since then, and I hate to say this, but I'm a smoker. It's a bad habit. I've stopped over and over again, but I keep going back to it, and maybe that's part of the reason. Just being nervous and trying to deal with things. But, I don't smoke in the house. I always go outside. I didn't want to smoke around my wife or my children. They don't smoke. I always go outside. But, over the years, there's been times that, like I said, I go out. I don't stay out there too long. Usually I just go out and take a few puffs off of it, a few draws, and put the thing out and get back to the house because I feel eyes on me. I feel like something's watching me the whole time that I'm out there. And I hear sounds out there that a lot of times I don't have any explanation for what it is. And I've heard calls, and by the way, I've heard one particular call up there at my house. I mean, behind my house, the state line, like I said, I live about maybe 500 yards away from the Virginia state line on the Tennessee side. But behind my house, the Virginia line runs at an angle, and there's nothing back there for miles but just raws and hollows and big high ridges and woodland. And off in the distance, I've heard a call or two in the past that when I've listened to these Bigfoot Sasquatch calls on the internet, I mean, they sound like some of them. And sometimes I get a smell up there that, I mean, I don't know how to describe it other than it's the putrid smell. It smells like a combination of something dead and an old wet dog and maybe animal dung or something like that, urine, and maybe skunk mixed in with that. And I mean, it's just a terrible smell. But I've never saw anything to identify what it is. And I told some people about it without saying anything about my encounter or suggesting in any way that I might possibly believe in Bigfoot or anything like that. Because like I said, I've got a very public and sensitive position of some authority and a trust with people, and I could lose that very easily if people lost confidence in me. So I don't tell anybody I believe in anything like that. But I've talked about that smell, and, you know, people will say, well, maybe you're smelling a coyote or maybe you're smelling a bear or something like that, but I just don't think that's what it is. And I've heard deer snort. I mean, there's deer come down in my yard and feed every night. And a lot of times during the day, I mean, they'll be 15 feet away from me. They don't pay me any attention because, like I said, I don't hunt. And nobody hunts up there where I live. My in-laws own the property around me, and they don't allow anybody to hunt. And so the deer are not afraid of human beings. And I've heard deer snort. I've heard bucks snort. I've heard bears snort. But there's something sometimes will snort at me. And it happened here about 3 weeks ago. And it was just in the edge of the brush off my back door. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear it there, and it was making racket, moving around in the brush. I could hear sticks snapping and things like that, and this thing snorted at me, or grunted at me, and it's a kind of a snort or a grunt. Like, I've not ever heard any animal that I know make that kind of sound. But they very well could be all around me, but I've never seen one.
Well, I sure hope it is a Bigfoot instead of a dogman you've been dealing with.
I do too.
Yeah, that'd be a much better situation. Let's bounce back to that encounter those sisters had for a second here. You didn't tell family or friends about your encounter, but did you tell those two sisters about your encounter?
No, Vic, I didn't even tell them, because it's not that I was afraid that they would say anything to me personally or think anything about me, because obviously they were telling me about something that was unexplained and wasn't known. But I was afraid they'd tell somebody else that I had told them about my encounter. And like I said, the position that I hold is very sensitive. I mean, I could lose it very, very easily. If people lost confidence in me, I could lose it and never be able to do it again. And I just can't risk that, and so I didn't tell them. I hated to hold back on them like that, because I really thought the world of them. I loved both of them. These were sweet old ladies, but I just couldn't tell them.
If you would have been able to share that info with them, I'm sure it would have helped both you and them, but given the reasons you just stated, I can understand why you didn't. That makes good sense.
Now, since, like I said, both these ladies, they were such sweet ladies and such wonderful friends to me over the years, and really, Vic, I regret so much now that I didn't tell them, because maybe by telling them what I went through, maybe it could have been a help to them. I don't know. But they're dead and gone now, and it's too late, and I can't go back, and I really regret that.
Well, like you said, you can't go back and change that, but I'm sure that it would have been a huge help to both them and to you, so it is a shame that you didn't do that. Well, JT, is there anything else about all this you haven't shared with me that you care to now?
Nah, I think I've told you all about it, Vic. Everything that I can remember.
Do you have any closing comments you'd like to share?
Well, I just like to tell people, if you have this kind of encounter with something like this, it's just not a good idea to bottle it up and not ever tell anybody about it. I realize that now. I know that in my early life, like I said, I went away from what I would describe as bad behavior in order to save my relationship with my wife and my children and the rest of my family. I corrected the bad behavior I was engaged in, but I know now that a lot of it was because of what I was dealing with, and it's just not good to bottle things up like this. And if they don't do anything else, if they are in a sensitive position like I am where they can't be public about it, they ought to at least contact you or some venue like you, and I can't think of anybody better than you, Vic. Of all the ones that I've listened to out there dealing with Dogman and Sasquatch encounters, too, as far as that goes, you're about the best I've ever heard, and I really appreciate it. And I'd advise them to tell somebody and let somebody know about what they've gone through and share it with them and get this thing off their chest, and maybe they won't go through some of the things that I've gone through.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think it is good to get it off your chest and put it out there. Well, thank you so much, JT, for coming on and sharing that experience with us. I really do appreciate it.
Well, I thank you, Vic, for the opportunity. I felt better the other day after I had reported the encounter, and I felt even better after you